Well, good morning, friends. It's good to see you guys. It's been a minute. I like all the faces that I get to look out and see. If this is your first time here, thanks for joining us. If it's not your first time here, also, thanks for joining us. For those of you that don't know, Emily and I were just on a couple week-long trip. We were up in the northeast part of the U.S., so we got to experience fall. I became a basic fall bro while I was up there. It's amazing. Apple cider and leaves and the rest. So I'd love to fill you in on kind of more details and what we experienced. But the number one thing you need to know is that the best lobster in the world is in Maine. The best lobster in the world. In fact, 90% of the country's lobster comes from the state of Maine, which is wild. So we had a couple amazing lobster rolls. Anytime you get a chance to get up there and have some good lobster, you should. Yeah. Well, now that we're back, nerds in the room can rejoice this morning. I come to you bearing good news of great joy for all the people. We're starting things off this morning with a little story from a book called The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. For those less familiar with the story, first, shame on you. But second, I'll give you kind of a lowdown. I'll set the stage for you. Lord of the Rings is this sweeping, epic fantasy tale set in a land called Middle-earth. It's filled with all sorts of rulers and powers and creatures and magic. And in the ancient age of Middle-earth, at the very beginning, there were forged rings, a collection of special rings called the Rings of Power. And they were gifted to different classes of beings, elves and dwarves and men and so forth. And those rings allowed each of those classes of beings to rule in their particular parts of Middle-earth to make sure that peace and harmony existed amongst all the people. But they were, all of them, deceived, for another ring was made. An evil ruler named Lord Sauron forged a master ring from the fires of a volcano called Mount Doom. J.R. Tolkien, the author of the story, hit that name of that mountain a little bit on the nose, I think. Mount Doom is where this ring to rule all rings was forged. And it gave the wearer untold levels of power over all things. The one ring to rule them all. And what we see is that ever since it was made in the world of Middle-earth, people fight over it. The ring had this spiritual and emotional control over humans. It turned them into monsters. They'd rage, they'd fight, they'd kill, all so they could have control and power in the world. Can you imagine that happening in our world? But then, during a great battle, the evil Lord Sauron was killed, and the ring fell out of his hands into the hands of other men who had a chance to destroy it. But spoiler alert, the hearts of men are easily deceived. They kept it, and they tried to take control themselves, and so more fighting ensued, and eventually the ring fell to the depths of the river Anduin, seemingly lost to time. For 2,500 years, it was buried. And then in a tragic accident, it was dug up again. And when that ring was dug up, it awakened this evil Lord Sauron again. He brought his ancient evil back into the world of Middle-earth, and suddenly everyone was tossed into a time of moral and social and political upheaval. The discovery of the ring had brought crisis to Middle-earth, and the only resolution was to destroy that ring. And in the middle of that crisis, through a series of very chance events, the ring actually fell into the hands of a young, humble character named Frodo Baggins. And Frodo is a hobbit. In the world of Middle-earth, hobbits are about as insignificant of beings as they come. They are literally small, about half the size of most humans. And their biggest aim in life is to live a nice, quiet life away from the rest of the world. Domestic life is their favorite. They just want to live at peace in their little homes. They're called hobbit holes. They want to eat their 7 little meals a day. Yes, hobbits eat 7 meals a day. Breakfast, second breakfast, 11sies, luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, and supper. These people know how to live their domestic life. Yeah, I see people saying amen in the room. The hobbits just want to get on with their little lives. They'd rather live in indifference to the rest of the happenings of the world. But now Frodo doesn't have that option because he has this ring that carries with it the fate of the world. And so whether he likes it or not, he is being thrust into a story that transcends his little life. And at one point, he has a conversation with his mentor and friend, Gandalf the Grey, about all of these things. And he laments to Gandalf the weight of this moment. He says this: "I wish it need not have happened in my time. I wish it need not have happened in my time." I don't know about you, but those words feel intimately familiar to me. Haven't we all, at some point in the last few years, thought or uttered those same words? It may not have been about a ring in a volcano, and if it was, I want to get coffee with you and hear your story. But all of us have come to face with things that we wish had never happened. Things we wish we didn't have to face. We wished a global pandemic and racial unrest and oppression need not have happened in our time, cutting us off from one another, causing division and anger. We wish divisive elections like the one we're facing on Tuesday need not have happened in our time, causing fear and anxiety and dehumanizing rhetoric to cause people to do things they never would otherwise. We wished a diagnosis or a death or a job loss or a breakup need not have happened in our time, forcing us to face pain head on. We wish the $5 footlong from Subway never went away. We wish it need not have happened in our time. All of us have arrived at a point in life, friends, where we simply wished that things had not gone the way they did. All of us have been Frodo at one point or another. But it's in those moments, when we lament the things going on in our time, we also need to remember Gandalf's response to Frodo. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. You guys, here's the truth. All of us are bound to encounter moments, seasons, events we wish we never had. But it's how we respond in those moments, how we show up in those seasons, that shape who we really are. As the Reverend Martin Luther King put it, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in times of convenience and comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And when we recognize that fact of life, we find an even greater truth comes to us. We find that God has actually been at work weaving our stories together, our gifts, our influence together precisely for the current moment in which we reside, precisely for such a time as this. Our lives are wrapped up in a larger story, one that began before we were born and continues well beyond our lives. And God is inviting each and every one of us to respond to that story exactly where we are. And so all we have to decide is what to do with the time given to us. We're continuing in this teaching series here at Midtown on the book of Esther. It's this remarkable story from the Hebrew scriptures that tells of a young Jewish orphan girl who's caught up in circumstances that she wishes need not have happened in her time. And it's precisely there that she's forced to reckon with really important questions about her identity, really important questions about her life. Can I really make a difference in the world in moments like this? Can my little life really have meaningful influence on the world? And is God really at work in the midst of this confusion and turmoil? And the point of the whole book is to answer each of those questions with a resounding yes. It exists to show us what real influence in the world looks like and how we can find it in our own time and place. And that theme becomes maybe most clear in the chapter we get to read today. Esther chapter 4. It's a pivot point in the story that changes Esther's life for good. So friends, if you have a Bible, I invite you to open it with me to the book of Esther. It's right smack dab in the middle of your Bible if you're flipping there. If you need to go to the table of contents, that's okay. Find the page number. Esther chapter 4 is where we're going to be. If you don't have a Bible, the words are going to be behind me on the screen, so you can follow along there as well. Esther chapter 4, starting in verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. And when Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hattach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. So Hattach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay. Yeah, there you go, Jordan, nice. Jordan remembers last week. That Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. So Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. And I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me, friends? Father, we come to you in many ways in a time that we wish need not have been. And we come to you in the midst of competing stories that come from within ourselves, stories that come from outside of ourselves, about what it means to be human, about how we ought to show up in the world. And I pray today, in this space, through your word, that your Spirit would show us the real story, the true story that goes beyond anything that happens this week or next month or the rest of the year. The true story that has been woven throughout history. Not only that, would your Spirit show us what it means to show up well in your story, what it means to use the position that we have for such a time as this, to participate with you in what you're doing. Melt our icy hearts. Show us in our heads and our hearts and our hands what it means to move with you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Chapter 4 in Esther starts a second act to the story. The first act kind of went for those first few chapters. And that first act, remember how it opens. The Jewish people are scattered in exile in the empire of Persia, this massive empire in the ancient world. And chapter 1 opens with a big party happening in the court of the king of that empire. And the whole point of the party is to show how absurd and laughable and ironic the ineptitude of that ruler is. His name is King Ahasuerus. He throws a frat party that would make any Sigma Alpha Epsilon frat bros out there blush. 180 days of partying, a massive display of his wealth and money and power, and of course, unlimited wine. And as a culmination to that party, the king, who apparently has more power than anyone in the world, calls his queen Vashti to display her beauty to a room full of drunken men. And she refuses. She stands up to his tyranny. And in doing so, she exposes how the king and his court are really a bunch of bumbling fools. Men who think they have control and power and influence, but are really impotent as leaders and as humans. And that gets her exiled by the king, and it leaves him in need of a new queen. And so in chapter 2, the king decides to solve his problem by piloting a new season of The Bachelor. It's true, it's called The Bachelor in Persia. It's airing on ABC later this week. All the most beautiful women of the land are brought to the courts, and they're trained for months in all the latest beauty and fashion and sexual expertise, and then they're given one night with the king to impress him. Sounds like something that would get great ratings today. And amidst all those women, against all the odds, one beautiful Jewish orphan girl named Esther pleases the king more than any other. And so she rises to the very center of cultural power in her time. She takes her position in the empire of Persia as queen. But there's a twist that comes in the story. See, there's a conspiracy going on behind the scenes in the king's court. Last week, Daniel introduced us to a character named Haman, who can best be described, yeah, there you go, Jordan, who can best be described as a little weasel of a man. He's prideful. He's an advisor to the king, and all he wants more than anything is power, authority, people to respect him. And so he schemes his way to the king's side. He becomes second in command in the king's court, and he forces all people to bow to him. There's just one problem. One Jewish man refuses to bow to Haman. His name is Mordecai. He's Esther's cousin. He actually adopted Esther into his family when she was orphaned. And he maintains faithfulness to God by refusing to elevate Haman. And when Haman hears of this, and specifically that Mordecai refuses because he's a Jew and he worships God, well, Haman is enraged. It drives him to spin a story to the king. He approaches the king and says, "King, there's this group of people, the Jews. They are rising to resistance and rebellion. You need to do something about them before they take things over. We've got to get rid of the Jews," he says. And the king agrees. An order is passed, starting on the day before Passover, which was the day that the Jews used to celebrate the deliverance of God through slavery. Well, on the day before that celebration, they're to be eradicated, and all of their property is to be plundered in Persia. And so Act 1, the first 3 chapters of Esther, closes on a dark day, and that's where we pick up in chapter 4. This evil edict has made its way to the people, and the events of chapter 4 are showing us what it looks like to respond to that sort of thing in the world, what it looks like to have real influence in this kind of moral and social and political turmoil. It shows us how we can become people who use our influence for good, to partner with God in his purposes in the world. And we see it in 3 main ways in this story. 3 things, principles about influence in the world. We see first that influence happens in the palace. Second, that palace influence is risky. And third, that good influence remembers the larger story. So first, influence happens in the palace. Right away, in verse 1, we see that Mordecai is mourning in the typical way that you would mourn in the ancient world, in sackcloth and ashes. That makes a lot of sense, but what's interesting is they make sure to go out of the way to tell you where Mordecai is mourning. Did you notice that? At the entrance to the king's gate, it says. That's an important detail. He's mourning at the gate to the palace. See, in ancient Persia, the city of Susa was the capital. That's where all this is happening. And on the western end of the city, there was a hill. And on that hill, sitting above everything else, was the palace and the palace complex. And that palace and complex were the peak of Persian culture. All the government officials, all the servants of the king, all the culture makers and artists and movers and shakers lived there. And all the laws and ideas that shaped ancient Persia flowed from the palace and the complex. That's where Mordecai's going. And guess who lives within those gates? Esther, his adopted cousin. Which means right now she is at the very center of culture and law and politics and art and engineering and education and everything else. The location that Mordecai mourns in is intentional. He's at the palace gates trying to get Esther's attention. And he does. His word about his mourning creeps its way up to Esther in the palace, and Mordecai has one purpose. It says in verse 8, he wants to charge her to go to the king and make supplication and entreat him for our people. In other words, he's trying to tell Esther, look where you are in our culture. Look at the influence you have right now where you are. You've got to do something about this evil. You've got to use whatever cultural and social capital you have to bring about justice and peace in the city. Because you're in the palace. That's where influence for social change happens. And it's pointing us to a crucial reality, friends, that we need to remember in times such as this. It's a reality that's echoed all over the scriptures. Friends, God's redemptive and restorative work comes not just through preachers and churches. It comes just as much through secular work. And I don't even like using that word secular because it implies this stark division between the sacred and secular. For God, that division is mostly a false one. All of creation is sacred, and all of creation is actually being caught up in God's redemptive and restorative purposes. It's not just about our private spiritual lives. God uses every part of culture to bring his healing into the world. Which means influence comes through the palace. It comes in all of the arenas of our public life where we spend our time. It comes when we allow God's character and love and grace and justice to radiate in all corners of the world. In fact, that sort of holistic, comprehensive picture of God's work is what the Bible has always been about. Look at the Bible's picture of the end of history in Revelation. God's ultimate goal for the world isn't individual souls floating off to heaven in some ethereal reality. It's God's life and power and presence coming down into the world now and transforming the material world for good. It's heaven coming to earth. At the end of history, we see that God's goal is that all things are healed. And that, by the way, was the thesis to Jesus' whole ministry. Right at the start of Jesus' ministry in both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is coming now. It is coming in and through me. And if you want to be a part of what I'm doing, it means you are bringing the kingdom of heaven here and now. The kingdom of heaven is as close as breathing and breaking into our world at every level. That's why he taught us to pray like we just prayed. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's why throughout the Bible, we get constant examples of the ways that God works through people in secular settings, not just in religious settings. Take the story of Joseph, for instance. Many of you are familiar with this, maybe from Sunday school. That's at the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph, at the time, was the favorite son of his father, Jacob. But there's a problem with having favorite kids. The non-favorite kids don't dig it that much. And so the non-favorite brothers get really mad and envious and angry, and eventually they decide we're going to sell Joseph into slavery. We're going to traffic our brother and then lie to our dad that he's dead. And so they do. They sell Joseph into slavery. He descends down and down and down, ultimately into prison in Egypt. But the story doesn't end there. He shows in prison this knack for being able to interpret dreams, and word about that talent gets to the king, who needs his dreams interpreted, and Joseph helps him out. And because of that, Joseph gets a secular role in the Egyptian government. He functionally becomes the Secretary of Agriculture in ancient Egypt. And that new position, not a religious one, actually allows him to wisely strategize food planning for Egypt for upcoming shortages. He says, in the harvest, we've got to do a really good job of being wise how we use our resources, so in case we have a shortage, we still can bless and care for all people. He does, and sure enough, a famine comes. And because of Joseph's wisdom, redemption, restoration, life, healing comes to the people of Egypt. And that includes his family. This remarkable turn of events at the end is that his family, his brothers, come to him because they are in need of food and famine. And they don't recognize Joseph. And eventually, after a series of events, Joseph reveals that it's him. And that as harmful, as hurtful as their betrayal was, he can see now on the other end that God was at work in all of it. That God was bringing his life and his redemption through means that, well, no one could expect at the time. But now, because of his role in the government, because of his role in culture, he's been able to care for his family. He's been able to keep his family alive. He's been able to bless countless others in Egypt. In other words, God's redemption comes through a sustainability and distribution employee in the government. That's what happens with Joseph. Same sort of thing happens in the book of Nehemiah. Some of you are familiar with the story of Nehemiah. Later in the history of the nation of Israel, the capital city of Jerusalem has been ransacked, torn apart. The walls have been torn down. In the ancient world, if your walls were torn down, it meant there was no security, no peace. Anyone could come in and do whatever they wanted in your city. And Nehemiah is this figure actually working in the Persian government at a time similar to the time where Esther is set. And he gets word that his city has been destroyed, and he grieves, he laments, he mourns. He repents for the ways that the people of his city have brought this destruction on themselves. And then he says, you know what? I need to do something about it. He was really well trusted with the king. He was the cupbearer to the king. And so he approaches the king and says, King, can I go to help restore the walls of Jerusalem? And the king says, great, whatever you need, money, means, go ahead. And Nehemiah goes and rebuilds the city of Jerusalem and helps bring people back out of the ashes into flourishing together. So in the book of Nehemiah, God's redemption comes through an urban planner. And now Esther is tasked in the same way. She's got an opportunity in the royal courts to effect laws that can bring justice and peace for her community. Mordecai is reminding her of that here. Friends, if God's kingdom is going to come, it's going to take all of us, wherever we are in the culture. Because there's so much healing that's needed. There are souls in our world that need healing. Our souls are turned inward on themselves. Our souls have forgotten that we are deeply loved by God. Our souls have forgotten what it means to love God and love others well. Our souls need forgiveness. And so part of God's redemptive work is healing souls. That's the work of the church. That's the work of preaching and proclaiming the good news of who Jesus is. We need that work in our world. But it's not just souls that need healing. There are relationships that need healing. Favoritism and war and gossip and violence and racism and family trauma and all the rest. We're divided from one another. We need to be healed, which means we need lawmakers to cultivate justice for the poor, the needy, the outsider, the marginalized. We need therapists to help us emotionally restore our relationships. We need teachers to help us learn about what it means to be human and what it means not to be human. We need business leaders and employees who don't try to crush others or maximize themselves at the expense of others, but who honestly and earnestly work to bring about mutual health and life in all that they do. And it's not just relationships that need healing. Our bodies and our world, our creation, need healing. Our treatment of the material world is actively destructive, and so famine and entropy and disease and death characterize our world, which means we need ecologists, biologists, scientists to help develop better ways of relating to our planet. We need nurses and doctors to help care for and cultivate life. We need engineers who can think wisely about how to build and grow and sustain things. We need farmers and blue-collar laborers to faithfully steward the land in ways that allow us to flourish. We need artists to imagine the world, help us shift the way that we see things, help us process our hopes and our griefs. Friends, God's work takes everyone doing their part in the palace. And God is calling everyone in this room, as he called Esther, to participate with him in that work. And truthfully, that might be one of the most neglected parts of what it means to follow God today in the church. I was reminded of this recently. Many of you know I teach part-time at Grand Canyon University. I get to help train people who are hoping to become ministers and help lead others in what it means to show up well in the world. And I teach a class called Christianity and Culture, which is all about how do we relate well the gospel to the culture that we're in. How do we learn to live well in the palace? That's what it's all about. And in the class, one of the assignments requires students to interview a couple different people. One person is somebody who's doing work in the neighborhood and community, but the second person is a non-Christian. You have to interview a non-Christian about their experience with the church and what maybe barriers exist for them back to the church. So I assigned this assignment, and more than half the class told me, I don't know a non-Christian. I don't know one non-Christian. And it made me think, oh, this class is really important. We live in a time right now, friends, where most of the culture thinks Christians are weirdos at best, hypocrites, and evil at worst. We need to learn how to live well in that culture. We need to learn how to cross outside of our boundaries here in the church. A lot of times we talk about spiritual formation as if it's doing more churchy things. That if you're really deep, you go to a ton of Bible studies and you worship well and you go to church. Those things are all good. I'm a pastor. I care about those things. Hear me well. Those things are part and parcel of a much bigger picture, which is how we show up and follow Jesus in every part of our lives. How we show up in our work, how we show up in our neighborhoods, how we show up in our schools. And guys, if we're being honest with ourselves, many of us use our position in the palace, our position in the culture, primarily for us. We're focused on our career advancement. We're focused on our pay, primarily to the end of having a home or a car or the material life we want. We use our work and life as a way to get ahead or self-protect or prioritize us. By and large, we use the cultural and intellectual and financial and relational capital we have for our purposes. We need to let Esther prompt a paradigm shift for us. We need to learn that a life of faith means seeing our place in the palace primarily as a tool to bless the world, and particularly those who are most in need. We need to learn to enter all of our spaces of influence, asking ourselves, God, where are you redeeming and restoring right here? How can I join you in that work? See, I look around this room and I see a ton of palace dwellers. I see beloved and influential and gifted people who have positions in every sort of sphere in our culture. Where are you at? What's your place in the palace? What's your work? What's your skills? What's your income? Where's the spot that God has placed you to participate in what he is doing? Mordecai is shouting to all of us from the palace gates, friends, there are people who need you. There are people on the margins, people who suffer, people mired in injustice or indifference or grief or loneliness who need you to use your influence to care for them, to love them, to advocate for them. That's what influence in hard times looks like, using our position in the palace. But the truth is that isn't easy. Esther's immediate response shows us that this type of palace influence is incredibly risky. Her response to Mordecai is immediately about all of the risks that are involved. She says this, if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is one law, they're all dead. And only if the king holds the golden scepter to someone may that person live. And I myself have not been called to the king for a month. Translation, Esther says that to do what Mordecai is asking her to do, to use her place in the palace to care for others and not prioritize herself, that could cost her everything. And not only that, she hasn't even seen the king in a month. She may already be on his bad side. And not only that, the last queen to stand up to this king got exiled. Esther hesitates because she knows it could cost her everything. When faced with this choice and the risks involved, she hesitates. She's got excuses. Well, sure, I know some of our business practices are shady, but if I speak up, it might cost me my job. Sure, I want to give generously. I just want to give after I've taken care of myself and gotten my comfort and my convenience, my upper mobility sorted out. Sure, I know my neighbor or coworker needs help, but I'm so busy and tired, and my effort can't really make a difference, and someone else will be better than me anyways, and well, football's on this afternoon. Friends, sometimes living in the palace insulates us from the call of God to use our position for the sake of others. That's what happens to Esther here. She doesn't even know this is happening. She's insulated. And sometimes that insulation means that our first response is an excuse to God's call. And Mordecai sees that hesitation in her, and he gives a remarkable and challenging response back. And his statement is the pivot point of this whole book. From this point forward, Esther's life changes for good because of what Mordecai says here. There's two things I want to point out that he says. First thing he says is this: do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will certainly come from somewhere, but you and your father's family will perish. He's basically playing out the scenario with her. He says, okay, let's imagine you do nothing because it's too risky to your comfort. Well, then all the Jews are going to die, and you're going to be found out eventually because you are a Jew. So if you choose not to speak up, you will end up losing everything you're trying to hold on to anyway. You see what he's doing? He's saying, sure, to put your privilege and status on the line for others could cost you everything. But if you don't put your privilege and status on the line for others, it will cost you everything. He's exposing a crucial point that is true for every one of our lives, friends. Everything we do involves risking our lives for something. Our life is not a choice between safety and risk. It's a choice between risking everything for yourself or risking everything for the sake of God and neighbor. Every day, you're putting your life on the line for something. The question is, what are you putting your life on the line for? Jesus actually gives us a brilliant parable about this in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 12. He's talking to people who were quite wealthy, and so he tells them of a wealthy landowner who had an especially huge harvest one year. And so he was forced to make a decision. What do I do with all this excess I have? And his choice is articulated actually kind of humorously in the passage. Here's what the man says when he gets this huge harvest. He thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, relax, eat, drink, be merry. 13 times in 2 verses, he references himself. He is entirely unconcerned with the way that this abundance might benefit anyone other than him. But then the irony comes. He dies the very night that he makes this choice. And God's response to him is clear. You fool. This very night, your life is being demanded of you, and the things you prepared, who's they going to be? Jesus' point is clear. The rich man took a risk. He risked devoting his time, his energy, his privilege, his work, his income, his life to himself. And it destroyed him. He lost everything because of it. Friends, what Jesus is saying is the result of risking your life on yourself means you lose yourself. Unless you're willing to put your position in the palace on the line for others as a service to the rest of the world, then the palace has already destroyed you. It's already consumed you. It's already taken you over. And here's the dynamics at work underneath this. The root, friends, so often of our excuses not to put our position on the line for the sake of others, not to consider our life as something to serve others. The excuses we usually give are rooted in identity. They're rooted in a belief that says my significance or my worth or my security or my comfort or my value is based upon what I have. My money or my job, my ability to live at a certain level of comfort. And if I have to put that on the line, that means I risk losing myself. We're too attached to the things we have. I will lose the thing that gives me significance or worth or security. And what that means, friends, is if you're unwilling, for instance, to put your resume on the line for the sake of someone in need, your resume has become your identity. If you're unwilling to put your money on the line for the sake of someone in need, your money has become your identity. If you're only able to see your work as something to further yourself and your career, your work has become your identity. Those things have consumed you. There's a great pastor named Tim Keller who told a great story about this years ago, of what it really looks like to put things on the line for others. He had a woman come to his church, visit his church on a Sunday. He had never met her before. So he went up and asked, hey, how'd you get here? What brought you to Redemption? A Redeemer was the name of the church he pastored. And she told a story about a major mistake she had made at work, one that would surely get her fired if it got found out. And so she approached her boss humbly and said, hey, I've made this mistake. And her boss said, okay. And then he went into a board meeting and took complete responsibility for what she had done. He told the truth, he told what had happened, but he did so in a way that put the blame and ownership on him, not on her. And he didn't have to do that. He could have come off scot-free. He could have chosen to, if he wanted, to actually look good in this situation. And she had never seen a boss do something like this. She'd seen plenty of bosses who took credit for the success of others, never a boss who would put their career on the line for the sake of another employee. And so she was curious, why did he do this? And so she went to him, she asked. And at first he was kind of dismissive. He was like, whatever, it's fine. We don't need to talk about it. Classic male, don't deal with emotions things, right? But she wasn't a male, she's a female, so she's like, I need to know. So she pressed him on it. And eventually, he told her this. He said, look, I'm a Christian. I believe Jesus Christ took the blame for me. And that's why I have the desire and the ability sometimes to take the blame for others. And she said, where do you go to church? Friends, what did she see in her boss? She saw an identity that wasn't captive to the palace. The palace had not taken him over. He had an identity that was not dependent on the status of his job and his employment. He was only able to truly love his neighbor well because he was willing to put everything on the line for them. He was willing to say, I will care for my employee, I will save her career, even if it costs me everything. If I perish, I perish. You guys, using your place in the palace for the sake of others will be risky. It might cost us dearly. But here's the truth. The circumstances and the results are mostly things we don't get to choose. The only thing we can choose is who to be. The only thing we can really choose is what we want to risk for. That's what Mordecai is making clear to Esther here. But there's a second thing he says too. He says to her, who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. He's saying that this moment has come to her for a precise reason. And it's subtle in English in the way we read it, but commentators point out there's something really important in the syntax of Mordecai's words here. They're mentioning, all these commentators are, about how his language indicates this has all happened to Esther. She has not made any of this happen. The story, she's mostly been passive. Everything has happened or been done to her. The king's party, Vashti's boldness, the bachelor in Persia, her beauty and appeal to the king, her current wealth and position of status, she didn't make any of that happen. Those are products of grace. Talents and gifts and doors of opportunity that were entirely gifted to her. She didn't choose them, she was chosen. And everything that has happened in her life led her precisely to that moment for such a time as this. And that points us ultimately to the final part of what healthy influence in hard times looks like, friends. We need to remember the story we're in. The person we choose to be is dependent upon the story we believe we're a part of. Mordecai is reminding Esther of the story that she's in the middle of. It's this grand story that far precedes her, of a good and loving God, of a God who created humans in his image to partner with him in creating shalom and peace and life for all things. And even when humans fail to love God and others and creation well, this is still a God who pursues them and who is at work weaving all things together to bring good. History is his story of inviting us back, each and every day, to join him in the redemption and restoration of all things. That is where this story is and has always been headed. And notice how confident Mordecai is in that fact. He says, look, if you don't choose to participate in it, I know that good is going to come regardless. Redemption and restoration are coming. It's up to you how you want to show up in it. C.S. Lewis had a famous quote in his book, The Problem of Pain. He said, God's purposes in the world are certainly going to come about. It's up to you whether you want to be Judas or John. And so now the ball's in Esther's court. What will be her part in this story of grace? Grace has led her to this moment for this purpose, but it's up to her to decide what she wants to do with it. She could choose to take advantage of all the grace she's been given, to further her own agenda, to double down on her own comfort, to self-protect. She could choose to do that. Or she could choose to respond to grace by giving her life away to God and neighbor. God is calling her in this moment. How will she respond? And friends, it's that reminder of grace that changes Esther's life. For the first act of the story, all the verbs that describe Esther are passive. They're things done to her. They're not things that she did. But from this point forward, she does things. She makes things happen in the world. Grace leads her to actually move, to do something with her life. That's what she does at the end here. She says, "Go, Mordecai. I'm in. And if I perish, I perish." Friends, don't miss the fact that we've got a mini gospel story here. In her words, "If I perish, I perish." That sounds a lot like an application of some words Jesus said. The one who loses their life for my sake will find it. This is Esther's moment of clarity. This is her conversion moment, where she realizes the grace that has led her to here and the grace that can spark her forward. You guys, I don't know exactly where you're at in this room today. I don't know the circumstance you find yourself in. I don't know what things in your life you might say, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." But I do know this. Every one of you is invited in the same story as Esther. In spite of all our running, in spite of all our fleeing, in spite of all the ways we've tried to use our place in the palace for the sake of ourselves, there is a God of grace who is calling to us. That God became human in Jesus to show us what it means to be human and who God really is. And when we nailed him to a tree, Jesus forgave. And when we buried him, he got up. Because this story is only a story of redemption and restoration. That's where you're being called. And all it takes is our response, to lose our life in order to find it. Friends, find where you are in the palace. Look clearly at where God has placed you. And choose to give yourself precisely there. Choose to say, "If I perish, I perish." Because in this story, in this place, God has you exactly where you are for such a time as this. Let's pray, you guys.